Here with us today of WWE. I think you all know George. You make the rounds, right?
Yeah, we do. Yeah.
But we're super excited this time more than
I'd like. But
well, that's okay. I'm more excited this time than normal.
Yeah.
Just because, and this is maybe something you don't like, but your stock has been so volatile. Yeah. It just makes the equity story that much more interesting. Mm-hmm. And so you had sort of a rough patch and then a reflexive rebound, and we get so many questions on your stock. I mean, there are just a lot of questions. So
perfect.
Maybe we can just start with a high-level question in terms of if you had to summarize 2019, what would you say went well? What were the key things that happened? What didn't go as you expected? And then we can sort of jump off from there.
Yeah, so a lot of activity. Probably the biggest thing on things that went well was the transition to the new platform on our DTC service. I think, if you, and we do, but you watch a lot of bigger organizations than us who are either launching or moving from one platform to another. And it usually comes along with a really, really rough early going. And while ours wasn't, I wouldn't say it was seamless, it actually worked really, really well. In terms of our fans and being able to ensure the continuity, the ability to access the events, and so on. So that was a lot of work from a lot of people at WWE, multiple functions, content function, the product function, the core tech function, the marketing function, and so that was great.
Okay.
Probably the thing that, and to some degree a little bit out of our control, but, we like to think we control quite a bit, was the engagement in over the first few months of the year. And obviously we're going through a generational transition from John Cena handing the baton to Roman. So if you think back in the history of WWE, and it was Andre to Hulk to Stone Cold to The Rock to John Cena. It's now moving to Roman. And then within that transition, or during that transition, we had, it was a kind of somewhat unique confluence of injuries and absences for a variety of reasons early in the year, and that it definitely we could definitely feel it on the engagement metrics. So I would say that was probably it was unforeseen heading into the year. So, but all in all, 19 was a pretty seminal event. A lot of the work that we've put in over the last 10 years, the fact that we got 35 billion video views in the year digitally. The fact that SmackDown Live is now available on broadcast, which still matters, at least in the United States. And we launched that. The fact that we made that transition to the platform, in a lot of ways, it's a unique launching. Kind of launching pad for the future.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So can I ask a derivative question? Because the other big thing that happened was NXT moving from your app over to USA.
Yep.
And I sort of look at that, and you can call me naive, but I sort of looked at that and said, there might have been a moment with the app where you said, we're going to serve the super fan, and maybe this might be, our ultimate direct-to-consumer play.
Yep.
And there's almost been a sea change as you've sort of recognized the appetite for live content among linear channels, where it's almost, I don't want to say you're doing a 180, but it's almost like a repositioning of the content where what the app might have been is actually going to look pretty different if the appetite of the linear guys for live stuff stays as strong as it has. Is that a fair characterization, or am I reading too much into this movement of NXT over to you?
Well, you may be amplifying it a little bit, but I'll tell you the way we think about it. And 10 years ago, which now is multiple lifetimes, one of the things that we were very focused on is developing a strong position. We already had a strong, at least by the engagement metrics, a strong position on traditional pay TV. We said we want to develop an equally strong position on the AVOD platforms, whichever ones might be the winners, and there are probably multiple. And we also believe that direct-to-consumer is going to become a viable way to distribute video content. So the goal was we want strong positions in all three, not really knowing how consumer preferences might shake out. We had a general point of view, but you don't know.
Yeah.
But what we were really committed on is strategically is having strong positions in all three. But if you step back and gets to your question, ultimately what we're about is creating content, and we create content to the goal of reaching as many people as we can, driving engagement so that for the people we reach, that they spend as much time as possible with the content. And if those two things then lead to direct monetization, which could be subscription revenue, license revenue, transactional revenue, and then indirect monetization, it helps promote other things that we do, kind of the 360-degree wheel. That's ultimately the strategy. So we were very focused on having a position on all three, but we're agnostic on the use of those three platforms and how the content is allocated among those platforms, other than, we're economic animals and we want to drive long-term shareholder value. And so the decisions we make about where to put different pieces of content is driven by that perspective. So then when you ask specifically about NXT, we looked around, we looked at the environment and said, there is a significant value that continue to be being placed on live content in the U.S. Video ecosystem. We think that's going to grow. What if we could develop another 2 hours of live content that is equivalent to the 5 hours that today's Raw and SmackDown? Well, boy, if you could do that, that's kind of a game changer.
Yep.
So let's see if we can do that. The negative, right? The other side of the argument is it's living on your DTC service today. By pulling that off, have you deprecated the DTC service? Mm-hmm. And so it's that delicate balance that we're always managing. And ultimately, we came to the conclusion that while there's manifestly some deprecation, we thought it was fairly minimal, and that the opportunity was big enough that it was worth taking that risk. So, the risk-adjusted return was pretty high. Yep. So which is what led us to the decision. And as we said, it's a short-term deal, and so we'll learn a little bit here over the term of the deal, and then at that point in time, we'll decide: do we still think it's worth continuing to pursue that, or is it better to kind of address the value proposition of the DTC? So long-winded answer, but it's so critically important because it's the core of what an IP-centric business does, is trying to decide the best way to tier the content.
So when I think of your stock, it had a very significant following among hedge funds, and I was always surprised at the number of questions that we would get, and I'm sure you would get, around the levels of engagement, particularly as the numbers are coming down. Yep. And it struck me as odd because there was no direct linear linkage between what those numbers are and whatever the quarter is. And when I think of our hedge fund clients, they tend to be more near-term focused. And when I pushed them on that, they said, well, no, I'm really nervous about these engagement numbers because if they don't turn around or stabilize, it's going to be very difficult to renew. I can't believe this came out of a hedge fund manager's mouth. Renew in the next renewal cycle, 5 years down the road, right?
I now think much more highly of them then.
But they're very concerned about it. So if an investor is sort of looking at the trajectory of the ratings, which I think got less bad in the last quarter, and sort of thinking about what you called a generational change in engagement, if you go back and you look at prior periods when these generational changes have happened, how long does it take before everything sort of comes back and normalizes?
And so there's not enough data points that I would say that I'd be comfortable saying, you can extrapolate the future, because they happen every 10 or 15 years, and so it's hard to know. But, in thinking through this a little bit, and going through my own memory banks, I remember when I joined WWE in 2008, and I'm not sure anyone who wasn't watching Raw or SmackDown knew who John Cena was. Mm-hmm. Certainly none of my friends. Actually, I found out that there were friends I had, very close friends, that were fans of WWE that I never knew about, and so they knew who he was. But those friends of mine who weren't wrestling fans didn't know who he is. Fast forward, and I'm not exactly when, I would say whether it was 12 or 13 or 14, whatever. But at some point, John became one of the most well-known athletes in the world. Yeah. because of our platform and obviously his incredible talents. So the combination of the two. But the point being, even he, not that long ago, was relatively unknown. Mm-hmm. We're going through that same transition today, and we certainly believe Roman is kind of the next iconic WWE superstar. We certainly have a lot more tools at our disposal. Again, when I started, we couldn't book John on any talk show, award show. Today, because of the strength of the brand,
no
problem with anyone, with multiple superstars, which is great. But there is, we do need our fans to kind of embrace this next generation, and that's a process. But when you ask the question, well, how much time? It's hard to know, and I think we'd be kidding ourselves if you said, hey, I've got 3 or 4 data points, and take the average of those, and that's the answer. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that's kind of particularly valuable. What we have at our disposal is tools that we never had: our social digital platform, the use of data to amplify kind of the connection of our talent to our fans. So that we definitely have tools that again we never had before. So we feel pretty confident on our ability to do that. But there's no doubt, we talked about in 2019, that change, but really hit with those absences kind of coming together at the same time was a hiccup we didn't kind of foresee.
Understood. If anyone has any questions, just raise your hand. I'm happy to entertain them.
Yeah.
One of the mistakes I see that happens over and over again on the buy side is a propensity to take U.S. sort of experiences, knowledge that our clients have, and extrapolate them into the international market somewhat erroneously. Mm-hmm. I'll give you an example. DirecTV, as soon as Comcast bought Sky, everyone said, oh my gosh, they just bought DirecTV, right? And for a lot of reasons, I would argue it's pretty different. Cord cutting is another example, right, where the trends are pretty different, U.S. versus international. But and I think one of the mistakes maybe investors made is they took the huge step up in the U.S. rights and just wanted to extrapolate that around the rest of the world. So can you spend a second in sort of qualitative terms, just describe what makes international the same or different from the U.S. market as you sort of sit down and negotiate for your TV rights?
Yeah, I think it's like every other, I've worked in multiple industries, and the fundamentals aren't really all that different. So the first input is how big is a particular market in terms of how much the end consumer is contributing, that then that revenue gets split through the value chain. So in the U.S., it's $200 billion of subscription advertising revenue that supports video,
yep,
whether it's Netflix or whether it's traditional pay TV. And it gets split up among connectivity, aggregation, and then scripted, unscripted, and live content. That's how that $200 billion gets spread around. Now, companies may own different or have, or play in different layers there, but there's 3 layers. That's basically it. So that $200 billion is a key input. It's the largest media entertainment market in the world by one order of magnitude to number 2. So the size differs. The second thing that goes into it is the kind of the regulatory framework that underpins the value chain. And for example, in this country, there's mandated that no cross ownership among networks, mm-hmm, right? So that creates 4 large players. Mm-hmm. That's good. That's good for the scripted, unscripted, and live kind of suppliers, yep, into the environment. That's not the same in every single market. And then the third question is, how strong are you relatively in each market? So how big is the market? What's the structure of the marketplace? And then, how much wholesale pricing power do you have within that? And it's different in every single market. So, yeah, if you said to me, what happens in Latin America, should we be able to extrapolate that's what's going to happen in China? I'd say no. I mean, it's very different size of the market, very different kind of value chain dynamics, and we have different positions in those markets. So there would be no reason to do this. So to your point, you shouldn't extrapolate what happens in Latin America to the U.S. or vice versa.
So I thought you were going to give a very different answer to that. So can I?
Sure.
Okay, so when I sort of described the difference, it wasn't the quantum of dollars, which is sort of what the value in the regs and how strong you are. It was more the quantum of the step up. That was the mistake I think the buy side made. And I thought that you got a bigger step up in the U.S. exactly because we're going through this transformative upheaval in the United States where everyone's cutting the cord, and live now undergirds the new pay TV subscription, where in the rest of the world, pay TV is almost synonymous with sports. So there isn't that discontinuity. Therefore, there isn't the quantum of the step up. Is that misguided?
Well, the step up, if you're going to focus on the step up, then an important input into that is where were you relative to the market going into that renewal? That's another element, right? So
you think the U.S. was just sort of under-monetized vis-a-vis where your international deals were?
No, I didn't say that. I said if the question is can one extrapolate from one market to the other, I would say no, because you're at a different starting point. The market itself is different, how big the economics are in the market. And that does also come into play. It's because it's not a linear relationship between a market's twice as large, so everything is then 2-to-1 relationship. There's the amount of discretionary funds available to kind of fund the value chain, so it's not linear. So my answer was just agreeing that you can't take what happened in one place and do it to another. But then when you talk about the step up, then you just also introduce the issue of where were you at one given point in time. So I don't want to talk about or indicate, how it pertained to us specifically one way or the other. But I would agree with you that it would be dangerous in any way to say what happens in one market means the same is going to happen for all the reasons we talked about.
So what deals in the international side have you? We know the U.S. deal, it sort of begins to roll in the fourth quarter of 19.
Yep.
On the international side, what deals have you completed so far, and which ones are still outstanding? That are chunky. I know I could.
Oh my God. Yeah, we probably
But chunky ones.
Yeah,
of the chunkier international ones.
Well, so we'll define quote unquote chunky by the. Back in 2014 or so, we said, look, our top 7 deals, which will then renew in the future, and we talked about those top 7. And we said those were U.S., U.K., India, Latin America, Middle East, Thailand at the time. So some have changed. China's over during the period kind of moved into the top 10. But if you looked at that grouping, the ones we haven't announced as of now are India and the Middle East.
Okay.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah. Just hit the button so everyone can benefit from your knowledge. I can ask it for you.
No, so I think the market's well aware of those that are outstanding that we're pending and waiting for, and I think that most people had been socialized that India potentially was up at 1231, and but if you go to the website of the distributor in India, it's still listed as on the air. So how do you answer where you are in that negotiate, knowing that it's a difficult thing to answer, but that is a fact, right? So how do we
I'm not
square that?
I'll kind of repeat what you said. We were public that our deal with Sony expired on December 31st, but Monday Night Raw at 6:30 a.m. on Tuesday, obviously 8 o'clock on Monday in the East Coast, was available on Sony, our current partner, yesterday. I'm not sure I can say a lot more other than that. People have asked, well, if you had a deal, would you announce it? And this, what I've said is, look, in the past, there are times where we've had deals and the announcement took a couple of months for whatever reason. Other times we've had deals, and once they got executed, within a few days, the PR teams had come together to kind of forge a common communication. So I can't say any more than that, other than, like you said, it's a fact WWE content's on Sony as we speak.
Can I ask a follow-up on another one of the chunky ones you mentioned? So Middle East, North Africa. So one area, maybe I'm the only one that got confused by this. I sort of thought there was like a broader Middle East, North Africa TV deal. But then there seemed to be some TV rights that were sort of related to the Saudi live events that you did that sort of superseded or augmented it or something. Can you just unpack that a little bit for us in terms of what you mean by Middle East, North Africa TV rights?
And probably the better way to describe it would be Middle East, North Africa rights, primarily for Raw and SmackDown.
Okay.
We've had agreements in that region, both free to air with NBC and pay with OSN. In the second quarter, I believe we said, when we confirmed or supported the guidance for full year 2019, we said one of the things that subtended that was our expectation of a new deal in the market.
Yeah.
That didn't come to fruition, so we talked about it in the third quarter, said we continue to work with GSA on those rights. We think we'll get a deal done, but it didn't come to fruition in the time frame that we thought.
Okay. But then that's separate and apart from any sort of broadcast of live content in Saudi Arabia is a totally separate deal. Is that right?
Well, we have two agreements for two events that we've been doing, large events. Those have media elements to those.
Okay.
But separate and apart from that, there's the rights to the core content, which is Raw and SmackDown, and also the content that currently lives on WWE Network.
Okay. So I know one of the things that investors have been grappling with for a while is just once all of these step-ups are sort of complete, and we talked about this last year, how much of that is going to flow to EBITDA? And that's sort of still an outstanding question. But then folks got really exercised when you lowered your guide on the third quarter call and you said, we've accelerated some of the investment.
Yep.
People sort of took that as code for, oh my gosh, more of the incremental revenue that I'm expecting in 2020 may in fact get reinvested in the business as you try and deepen the level of investment and engagement in these local markets. So is that an erroneous interpretation of what you were trying to convey on the third quarter call, or a reasonable interpretation?
Well, there's a kind of extrapolation there into the future. What we were trying to convey on the call were the facts, which is there were costs that in the second quarter we didn't foresee bringing forward into 2019, which ultimately we decided to do. And people have asked, well, how do you make those decisions? And ultimately, not to oversimplify it, we build a DCF, and we decide how do we maximize the output of that model, and we decided that the decisions we made kind of would result in that. So we brought some costs in. How much of that is, or to your question of, are people misinterpreting? They're not misinterpreting the fact that we brought them in. Whatever assumptions they were making, I'm not privy to all of them. So, but ultimately for us, what we're trying to do is create as valuable a franchise as possible. We thought it was the right thing to do at that point in time. Okay.
What if as you try and deepen engagement and sort of localize the content in any countries, what is there an analog you can point to where you've done this in one part of the world, or something to help investors sort of size what they're talking about? Because this is this is the number one question we get, right? Like, how much would it cost to sort of, if you wanted to go localize content in India or localize content in Saudi Arabia, what does that entail? Are there any analogs in the history of WWE where you could say, oh yeah, well, when we did this, that was a $10 million outlay, and we did this, and that was a $5 million, just something, so people can at least try and do their own math?
So before I answer that, and I'll answer it specifically, I think if I were thinking about investing in WWE, I would try to form a perspective on three things.
Okay.
Number one, how valuable do I think live rights are going to be within the U.S. over the next few years? Number two, how much growth do I think there will be in the media and entertainment sector outside the U.S. over the next 5 to 10 years? And then number three, where do I think WWE stacks up in terms of the relationship between its engagement and its ability to monetize through sponsorship and advertising? Our perspective generally is live rights are going to become even more valuable in the U.S. over the next 5 years.
Yes.
Our perspective is that 60-70% of the growth in global media and entertainment is going to come outside the U.S. over the next 5 to 10 years. And number three, we believe that we do over-index on the sponsorship side relative to our engagement. So then when we talk about investing, you see us invest a lot in the things that line up with those three opportunities. Okay. So it could be localizing content. It could be investing in digitization writ large, understanding our consumer, delivering content to our consumer, growing the audience, strengthening the brand. It could be investing in our superstars, strengthening their individual brands, because all those, whether it's the brand, the localization, the content, the digitization, are geared towards those three monetization opportunities. So every decision we make is through that filter. When you say, hey, has there been examples in the past that you can point to? I'd say the last 10 years, when for us, 10 years ago or so, and we said, well, what do we think the opportunities are into the future? We said, the value of our live content is completely disconnected from the intrinsic, the eyeballs that we deliver, which is the intrinsic value to an acquirer of the content. And there's a complete disconnect there. We think we know why, but we fundamentally believe there's a disconnect. We believe there will be real monetization opportunities in direct-to-consumer and then digital and social. So we invested heavily in driving that. We had a home run on the live rights in the U.S. A couple of cycles it took to do that. We still think there's headroom there. We doubled the revenue and profitability that we were getting from the content that supports the DTC service, which used to be the pay-per-view business. And then we created, it's not an insignificant advertising and sponsorship business, more on the media at the side of it, as opposed to the sponsorship through the digital, right? It's something that was $75 million for us in 2018, significantly smaller when we started. So I would say not specifically on the international, because that's something new. We haven't had to do that. But I believe the investments we've made over the last 10 years going after what we thought were the opportunities have worked out pretty well for us. The international is, the live, so if we look to the future, the live rights are still there, we think, both because we believe we still are a pretty good value today, and we think live rights generally are going to grow. So those two things together, so there's still opportunity there. We've done a decent job of going into media budgets from brands, but not a good job on the sponsorship budget. We think that's an opportunity for us. And we now think, the media entertainment sector outside the U.S. is going to grow pretty significantly over the next 5 to 10 years. So then when we think about the investments we're making, it's about that. So to your point, can I say, hey, I built an academy already and it was successful? No, we haven't done that yet. That's the next wave. But balancing the returns over different time frames is, we've been talking about it implicitly, but to be explicit about it is a big part of the discussion. Some of the investments we make today will generate economics in 2020, 2021, 2, and 3. Some of them may not generate the lion's share of the economics of 2025, right? When our most valuable product is back in the market. And then some of the investments may not be post-2025. If I do a performance center in China, if that were one of the markets, that probably is a little bit of a longer play. So we're trying to kind of, again, as we build the DCF, is balance those time horizons.
And I always think of your management team as, I know overhead was a big area of concern. But I sort of think of your management team as pretty lean and pretty savvy. And at some level, I'm like, well, there's only so much money they can spend sort of navigating all of these different initiatives. Is that a real constraint or not really? Do you feel more like...
Well, we're a small company, generally speaking, so there's almost only so much, to your point, that we can take on. I think that's generally fair. But I would hate to think that, if you really thought there was an opportunity to create shareholder value, I think it would be pretty lazy to say, it was bandwidth that kept us from going after that. So
makes sense.
We kind of tend to think a lot right to left of what's the size of the opportunity, do we have the right to win in these pockets, and if so, then let's go get it. Okay. Let's figure out how to go get that.
Any questions from the audience? I certainly don't want to. So let's talk about the WWE network.
I mean, why should that? You're doing all that. You're doing all that.
That's right. Yeah. So you haven't grown subs at the and this is a smaller part of the narrative, I think, for your equity recently, but you haven't grown subs for a while. Some suggest it has to do with those sort of engagement numbers you were talking about earlier on the live side or linear side. Some say it's more about NXT. Some say it's the pricing's wrong. So if you sort of had to just look forward in terms of if something changes on the WWE sub numbers, do you think it's going to be more about getting the engagement level up, more about sort of doing something with tiering or tweaking the price, or is there some other issue that I haven't thought of?
Well, I think if you look at just on a year-over-year basis, this is the first time we were down year-over-year. So if you said to me, why do you think that is? I'd say that's wrapped up into the engagement discussion. If you said, over the longer term, what's going to drive the growth of that business, the engagement's got to work for everything to work, including, but if we assume, ceteris paribus, you get to some level of, a natural level of engagement like we have in the past, and the generational transition that I mentioned goes well, like it's always gone in the past, then if you said specifically within that context, the DTC service, I think it's, we've launched a free tier now in the service. It's very, very early days. We really won't know the efficacy of that for several months, maybe a year, but we're excited. We think the elimination of friction of going from free to paid by having a robust free tier is powerful.
And how would that differ from just like YouTube engagement or something like that?
Yeah, well, so today, if you think about it, you're going from YouTube to, if you're a fan, you're experiencing it on YouTube, maybe you're experiencing it on Fox or NBCU, and you're like, I think I want to subscribe to the network. You go in, the first thing you're going to be hit with is a credit card. So you don't know what the product really, we can tell you what it is, but you don't really know what it is. Yeah. And you need the credit card, and you have to subscribe. We think the ability to bring someone in to the service where you can experience the product, you can't experience all the content, but you can experience the product, you can live within that for a period of time, gets you more comfortable to eventually say, I'm willing to give you credit card. So that, to us, is a sea change in how we move consumers through the content funnel, if you will. So that's one. We've talked about a premium tier. There's a lot of ways we touch the consumer, and we think there's a way for us to wrap it together to create value for the consumer and by extension create value for us. So whether if you're a shop, if you're buying on WWE Shop and you're purchasing tickets over the web, and you're also a consumer of video, is there an experience we can give you, some additional content, some additional features, bring some additional perks around those other activities and bring those together? We think we can create a lot of value for our biggest fans. And so there's a potential ARPU play there for us on that part of the tier. And then the localization. I mean, I think you mentioned, it's not a surprise to us that a $10 product in U.S. currency, only in English, may not work in some markets to the degree that it could, right? This is not a surprise. As we built this business, I mean, you talk about choices and investments, we decided every subscriber that we acquired internationally under the current construct was completely profitable, right? We were leveraging the fixed cost. And 25% of the subs, so for our size business, not a small number, 400,000 or so at a $10 ARPU. That's almost, it's 80% profitable. The next opportunity is, do you think in some places localizing across the dimensions we talked about, language, commerce, pricing, can drive incremental growth? We think it can.
Yes.
Then the question is one of pacing, right? Because some of the investments may take a year or two to return. Those are the things, again, as we think of time frames, 2020 to 2024, 2025, the next big renewal cycle, and then beyond, it's pacing all this investment to avail ourselves of the opportunity. But, we do think it's there. And we have investors, by the way, who have said, boy, why don't you guys just go hard, even harder now? Yeah, why are you trying to pace?
Right. Because Jason keeps asking me these annoying questions.
But I think, look, it was something an old boss, and it was kind of one of these truisms. It was at Praxair, and he said, he goes, George, you know what the easiest thing to do in business is? Manage for the short term. Cut costs, you can improve the numbers tomorrow. The second easiest thing to do is manage for the long term. Just invest for something that'll come. Mm-hmm. He goes, the reason we pay you and everybody else is to balance those two things. And so, we're trying to do that, is not only deliver in the short term, invest for the long term, but also kind of manage that interim period.
So I have time for one last question. How would you, this is probably the second, maybe third most common question we get, competition from AEW.
Yeah.
How would you, is that like something you've seen 10 times before and this is like a nothing, or is this like, oh, gulp, we're going to need to invest in our content and now there's a war for talent and everything is going to get more expensive than it was in the past? On the continuum of sort of existential threat to rounding error.
Well, so look, I'm a kid from Queens, so everything is a competition, everything is a fight. So there is, I would say that's one of the things I love about WWE. Kind of, it's my DNA fits within that. So we don't take anything for granted, and we are serious like a heart attack around fighting for our unfair share. Having said that, I think it's fair to say that there's been other wrestling in the United States and abroad, who we respect the people behind it, we respect the talent, we respect what they do. It can be tough to compete with us because we're so good at what we do. We've built up capabilities and competencies over a long, long time, how to build stars, how to present the content, how to engage fans now over multiple platforms. And we think, we're hard to compete with. So I would say we don't take anything for granted. If you said to me, existential, do I feel that way? No. But I love a good fight, so we enjoy it.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the time.
Awesome.
This is great.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
that's great.
Of course.
Thank you.